Before you answer that question, consider this. The 2023 report has this to say about self-regulation in Covent Garden. The Covent Garden SPA suggested self-regulation or a scheme similar to the one used in the past. Self-regulation has been considered previously, but issues with obstruction and noise persisted. To see what they meant by previously, I looked at the Council's Busking Policy Report draft in 2020, published in December of that year. This is the final report calling for a new busking licence in Westminster, and it's the one that influenced the councillors to vote. In it, it says, having an SPA has provided the council and businesses in the area a location-based code of conduct designed specifically for the area. Complaints, however, continue to arise even here. That complaints continued to arise was a surprise to everyone at the time. The buskers in Covent Garden were adamant that there were no issues with the complaints on their pitches. Who was correct? Let's find out. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association manages two pitches. One of them is the iconic St. Paul's pitch, otherwise known as the West Piazza. That's the famous one. The other is Magic Corner, right at the end of James Street. The former is exclusively used by circle shows, the latter exclusively by, you guessed it, magicians. Both are active for about 10 hours a day and both are fully amplified. Here's how the council describes their organisation in their 2023 report. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association has been operating since the 1980s and has implemented a performer-run and self-regulated system with its own rules, governing body and disciplinary scheme, dealing with any problematic performers and ensuring insurance coverage and acceptable noise levels. They utilise a yellow and red card approach for addressing misconduct, including suspensions for repeated bad behaviour. Sounds great, but does their system work? Maybe not. Between 2017 and 2019, there were 180 complaints about busking noise on James Street. However, 3 of them weren't about buskers at all, 24 were up the other end of James Street, 1 was all the way over on Oxford Street, 42 of them were about musicians, not magicians. 70 of the complaints, therefore, were definitely not about SPA pitches. Magicians, on the other hand, were only mentioned 8 times. However, there were 7 complaints that used some form of the word shouting, so they probably were about the magicians as well, who tend to talk more than play music. Let's assume all 15 of those complaints were about CGSPA members. Of the 85 complaints that we can identify, 15 were probably about CGSPA buskers and 70 weren't. That means roughly 18% of complaints were covered by the Covent Garden Street Performers Association. There are still 96 complaints remaining. 25 of them mention amplified music. I reckon that means that they were more likely to be about musicians, but as magicians do sometimes perform with backing tracks, we'll ignore that. Multiplying that 96 by the 1570 ratio above, which is our best guess for how many of those indeterminate complaints were actually about magicians, you get another 17 complaints, bringing the total to 32. As for the West Piazza, there were 24 complaints listed as being in Covent Garden between 2017 and 2019. Well, 2 definitely weren't on the West Piazza. 2 were about buskers up the other end of James Street next to Covent Garden Tube Station. 1 of them was actually a complaint about a council official, and 7 were about musicians. That's 12 that definitely weren't the responsibility of the SPA. There was only 1 complaint that was definitely about a busker performing on the St. Paul's pitch. That's another name for the West Piazza. Funnily enough, that's the same number of complaints against a council officer. Anyway, 1 definitely about SPA buskers, 12 definitely not about SPA buskers. That's a rate of 8%. Doing the same maths as before, the West Piazza may have gotten 2 complaints in total. On James Street, 32 complaints. On the West Piazza, 2 complaints. That's a grand total of 34 complaints about SPA-run pitches over a period of 24 months. That's 17 complaints a year. Put another way, for every complaint that the Covent Garden Street Performers Association received in that period, they'd performed, always amplified, for 472 hours. It seems, then, that amplification is not the problem. The Covent Garden SPA's code of conduct and system for disciplining its members is enough. Perhaps that's unsurprising, given that their methodology has been practiced and refined over the decades, and that it has 100% buy-in from its members. Considering this success, it's no wonder that the SPA had an agreement with the council and the market's private land managers since 2007. Of course they do. In return, approximately 45 million people visit Covent Garden each year, and the street performers there are loudly promoted as the best reason to visit in every tourism guide or online review website like TripAdvisor or Google Maps. What proportion of those 45 million people come to watch the buskers? 1 million? 2? How many tens of millions of pounds in tourism spend do those buskers bring in? Or, put another way, the Borough of Westminster got almost 2,000 complaints per year over this period. Covent Garden SPA pitches received just 17. Surely, this would convince the council to leave Covent Garden as is. Apparently not. Instead of congratulating them for a phenomenal job reducing complaints, that 2020 report was worded to make the SPA sound ineffective. Even worse, the buskers were completely blindsided. In all previous discussions, it was clear that Covent Garden would be left out of the licensing regime. Here's what the SPA thought about it, according to the authors of the Council's 2023 report. In Covent Garden, they believe there are limited noise issues associated with buskers and street performers. Initially, Covent Garden was not included in the busking and street entertainment licensing regime, but was added late in the process with no clear justification or reasoning. That's not a belief, that's a fact. There was no justification or reasoning in that 2020 report for why suddenly Covent Garden had been added to the license. If that decision was the result of any debate, that debate was behind closed doors and never explained. Try to put yourself for a second in the position of a Covent Garden Street Performers Association manager. 40 years of history, a robust system of self-regulation, a clean record, a good relationship with local businesses and the landlord and the council, and then, with no explanation, the council criminalises the vast majority of your shows. Is it any wonder that the Street Performers Association recommended to their members that they shouldn't sign up for a licence? Unfortunately, making that recommendation put the SPA in a tricky position. The three key characteristics of what's called an organised crime group is that they have a hierarchy, a profit motive, and commit a series of crimes over an extended period of time. The SPA is run by a few volunteers, the shows the buskers put on make money, and every one of them is a criminal act. In other words, Westminster City Council has turned the CGSPA into the busker mafia. I made that joke in a group chat with some SPA members. They didn't find it funny. The council has already used the term mafia in meetings to describe us, one said. Let's not do that work for them. So, that's the context. Let's look at the period of 2021 to 23. Why was Covent Garden the second most talked about area in the latest report? Is it because the council wants to attack the SPA, or is it because of complaints? The report claims that 305 complaints are situated within Covent Garden. Wow. The Covent Garden buskers put in another Freedom of Information request asking for the latest data, and for the first time, without explanation, the data the council produced was stripped of any identifying features. Why the change in policy? Unclear. But let's just take 140 complaints a year as the truth. According to previous data, only 8% of Covent Garden complaints are about the West Piazza. Assuming the same holds true today, then the West Piazza received 11 complaints per year. During the year, the buskers put on 4,866 shows on the West Piazza. So even if we are to believe that Covent Garden is suddenly 12 times as bad as it used to be, still, for every complaint received about the West Piazza, the buskers there put on 442 shows. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but some of the buskers are beginning to believe that as they are objectively doing a good job, and have done for decades, the report's authors have focused so much on Covent Garden pitches and been so misleading because they're trying to punish the SPA for ignoring the licence. And it's worth repeating, that's a licence that only 10% of their members could even get because it bans everyone else's shows.